June 10, 1945. The hills south of Shuri, Okinawa. Morning mist clung to shattered limestone ridges as soldiers of the 383rd Infantry Regiment, 96th Division, manhandled a strange weapon into position. The tube measured 82 inches long, weighed 110 pounds, and looked like nothing the men had seen before. No recoil mechanism, no heavy carriage. Just a rifled barrel with an enormous flared exhaust cone at the rear. A Japanese observation post, carved into coral 300 yards distant, had pinned down 2 companies since dawn. Machine gun fire swept the approaches. Mortars bracketed every movement. Artillery couldn't touch it without collapsing the entire hillside onto American positions below. Then the gunner settled behind the weapon, loaded a 14-pound shell, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon didn't buck, didn't slam backward into the gunner's shoulder. Instead, a massive plume of fire and propellant gas erupted from the rear as the shell screamed toward the target. The cave entrance erupted in flame and coral dust. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun was silent. The entire position, dug into rock that had withstood days of conventional bombardment, had been obliterated by a single shot. This moment marked the combat debut of the 75mm M20 recoilless rifle. What Japanese defenders initially dismissed as another American artillery piece would systematically demolish their confidence in fortifications that had held for weeks, forcing complete recalculation of defensive warfare from Okinawa forward. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were elegantly devastating. The M20 weighed 114 pounds. A conventional 75mm pack howitzer weighed 1,270 pounds. Yet both fired similar projectiles with comparable effect. The weight ratio was revolutionary. More importantly, the M20 could be carried by 2 men. The pack howitzer required a full crew and usually a mule. This portability transformed infantry warfare. For the first time, rifle companies possessed organic artillery-type firepower that could go anywhere soldiers could go. The weapon's origins traced not to Okinawa, but to decades of theoretical research into defeating Newton's third law. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When a conventional gun fires, the explosion that propels the projectile forward generates recoil that slams the weapon backward. This recoil requires heavy recoil mechanisms, thick barrel walls, and substantial weight to absorb the forces involved. But what if the rearward force could be vented away? The concept wasn't new. Leonardo da Vinci sketched recoilless weapons in the 15th century. In 1879, Alfred Krupp filed a French patent for recoilless gun designs. During World War I, Commander Cleland Davis of the United States Navy developed the Davis gun, which fired projectiles in opposite directions simultaneously, cancelling recoil through equal opposing forces. The British tested Davis guns on Handley Page bombers as anti-Zeppelin weapons, but these early designs proved impractical, too complex, too heavy, too unreliable. The fundamental problem remained unsolved. By the 1930s, military theorists in multiple nations pursued recoilless weapons independently. The Soviet Union developed the model 1935 76mm recoilless rifle designed by Leonid Kurchevsky. A small number mounted on trucks saw combat in the Winter War against Finland in 1939. The design proved unsuccessful. Germany achieved the first practical success, developing weapons for airborne troops who needed artillery that could be parachuted into battle. German engineers created the 7.5cm Leitgeschütz 40 in 1940. This smoothbore recoilless gun used a plastic blowout plug in the cartridge case base. When fired, propellant gases blew out this plug and vented rearward, counteracting recoil. The weapon could be broken down and dropped by parachute, then assembled and fired by a small crew. German airborne forces used the Leitgeschütz 40 during the invasion of Crete in May 1941. The weapon proved effective but had limitations. The plastic plug system was unreliable. Accuracy was poor due to the smoothbore barrel. Still, it demonstrated that recoilless weapons could be practical. American intelligence obtained information about German recoilless developments. This intelligence reached the Ordnance Department's Small Arms Division by 1942. Simultaneously, American engineers had been working independently on similar concepts. The breakthrough came from combining two separate innovations. First, the Bresner-shaped charge warhead. By 1942, American ordnance had perfected the M10-shaped charge grenade, which used the Monroe effect to focus explosive energy into a superheated jet capable of penetrating armor. This warhead didn't require high velocity to be effective. The jet formed by the shaped charge did the work regardless of projectile speed. This meant recoilless weapons, which typically achieved lower muzzle velocities than conventional guns, could still deliver devastating anti-armor capability. Second, the perforated cartridge case. British inventor Denistone Burney had developed this system. Instead of a blowout plug, the cartridge case had hundreds of small perforations covered by a plastic lining. When fired, propellant gases escaped through these perforations into a vented breech chamber, then exhausted rearward through large vents. This system proved more reliable than German plastic plugs. American engineers began testing in 1944. Two separate development paths emerged. The artillery section worked on a large 105mm recoilless cannon based on captured German designs. The infantry section pursued a man-portable weapon using the British perforated case system. Engineers named Kroger and Musser led the infantry section work on a 57mm design. Their weapon used another innovation, pre-engraved rotating bands on the projectile that engaged the barrel's rifling. This reduced friction during firing, allowing more propellant energy to accelerate the projectile, rather than being vented rearward for recoilless effect. The result was higher velocity than most recoilless weapons achieved. Tests in November 1943 proved the infantry section's design superior. The artillery section's 105mm project was cancelled. The 57mm weapon was designated T-15, then redesignated M18 in late 1944. Production began immediately. But, even as the M18 entered production, ordnance engineers recognized a need for a larger caliber weapon. The 57mm was excellent for its weight and portability. However, its high explosive shell was relatively small. Against fortifications, larger explosive payloads would be more effective. Development of a 75mm variant began in parallel with M18 production. The 75mm weapon followed the same design principles as the 57mm. Perforated cartridge cases, rifled barrel with pre-engraved projectiles, vented breech, exhausting rearward. The weapon was designated 21, then standardized as the M20 recoilless rifle in early 1945. The M20 specifications reflected its design priorities. The barrel measured 6 feet 10 inches in overall length. Weight was 114.5 pounds, though some sources cite 110 pounds depending on configuration. Despite these numbers, the weapon was designed as portable infantry equipment. 2 men could carry it. More importantly, it could be broken down into components for transport, then assembled quickly in combat. The barrel was smooth in external appearance, lacking muzzle brakes or other complications. Carrying handles were positioned along the sides just aft of the midway point, allowing 2 soldiers to lift and carry the weapon. The rear featured the distinctive enlarged conical exhaust section that tapered outward. A vented screen cap covered this exhaust port, directing propellant gases safely away from the crew. The weapon could be fired from an M1917, a 1 machine gun tripod, the same mount used for water-cooled Browning machine guns. This meant infantry units already possessed compatible tripods. Alternatively, the M20 could be mounted on vehicles, typically jeeps, providing mobile firepower. Sighting systems included both a telescopic sight for precision fire and a leaf sight for general use. Operation required a minimum crew of 2, a gunner and a loader, though 3-man crews were common. The gunner aimed and fired. The loader handled ammunition and loaded rounds into the breech. a third crewman could carry additional ammunition and provide security. Ammunition came in several types. The primary anti-tank round was the M309 high-explosive anti-tank shell, designated HET. This 20.5-pound projectile used shaped charge principles to penetrate up to 100 millimeters, approximately 4 inches, of armor plate. Muzzle velocity was 1,000 feet per second. Maximum effective range was 7,000 yards under ideal conditions, though practical anti-tank range was much shorter, typically 300 to 400 yards. For use against fortifications and infantry, the M309, a one-high-explosive round, weighed 21.8 pounds. This shell was designed to fragment upon impact, creating shrapnel effects against soft targets. Range was similar to the heat round, approximately 4 miles maximum. White phosphorus smoke rounds weighed 22.6 pounds and were invaluable for creating smoke screens or marking targets. Later in the weapon's service life, additional ammunition types were developed, but in June 1945 at Okinawa, these 3 types comprised the available arsenal. The firing sequence was straightforward, but required careful crew coordination. First, the crew positioned the weapon and established a clear danger area behind it. The backblast extended approximately 60 feet to the rear in a 45-degree cone. Anyone caught in this zone when the weapon fired would be killed instantly by the blast of superheated propellant gases. This backblast was the weapon's most significant limitation. In confined spaces, bunkers, or buildings, the M20 was unusable. The exhaust would kill the crew or anyone nearby. The weapon required open terrain with clear space behind it. Second, the loader opened the breech and inserted a shell. The perforated cartridge case contained the propellant charge. When the round was fully seated, the breech closed automatically. Third, the gunner aimed using either the telescopic or leaf sight. The telescopic sight provided precision at longer ranges. The leaf sight worked for quicker target engagement at closer distances. Fourth, the gunner squeezed the trigger. The firing pin struck the primer, igniting the propellant. As gases expanded, they drove the projectile forward through the barrel. Simultaneously, gases escaped through the perforated cartridge case into the breech chamber, then exhausted rearward through the vents. The forward momentum of the projectile was balanced by the rearward momentum of the exhaust gases. Net recoil was negligible. The weapon didn't slam backward. It sat almost motionless on its mount. This lack of recoil meant the crew could immediately observe the impact and adjust fire if necessary. Conventional artillery moved significantly when fired, requiring crews to re-aim after each shot. The M20 remained on target. Rate of fire was approximately 6 rounds per minute with a trained crew. Loading, aiming, and firing could be accomplished smoothly and rapidly once crews gained experience. Production of the M20 began in March 1945. The timing was critical. By spring 1945, American forces were closing in on Japan itself. The invasion of Okinawa, launched April 1, 1945, represented the final stepping stone before the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Okinawa was expected to be the bloodiest battle yet. Intelligence indicated the Japanese had fortified the island extensively. Natural cave systems in the limestone and coral rock had been expanded into elaborate defensive networks. Previous island battles had proven that conventional artillery struggled against such fortifications. Shells that would devastate surface positions often accomplished little against targets buried in rock. The M20 offered a potential solution. Its direct fire capability meant crews could aim precisely at cave mouths, bunker entrances, and fortified positions. The weapon wasn't dropping shells in an arc like howitzers. It was shooting straight at the target like a rifle, albeit a very large rifle. This precision, combined with the devastating explosive power of a 75mm shell, might finally give infantry units the capability to reduce fortifications without calling for airstrikes or massive artillery bombardments. Limited numbers of M20 recoilless rifles were rushed to both the European and Pacific theatres in March and April 1945. In Europe, The weapons arrived as Germany was collapsing. Some units received them in time to use against final German defensive positions. But the war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. Before the weapon could be widely deployed or thoroughly tested, the Pacific Theater became the M20's proving ground. Okinawa became its crucible. The island measured approximately 60 miles long and varied from 2 to 18 miles wide. Shaped roughly like a long, narrow body, Okinawa's southern portion contained most of the population and the most defensible terrain. When American forces landed April 1st, they initially met light resistance. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, had decided against defending the beaches. Instead, he had withdrawn his forces to the southern portion of the island, where they had fortified 3 defensive lines that stretched across the narrow width of the island. These lines, anchored on ridges, escarpments, and natural strongpoints, were designed to exact maximum American casualties. The Shuri line formed the heart of Japanese defenses. Named after Shuri Castle, an ancient Ryukyuan fortress that the Japanese had incorporated into their defensive system, this line consisted of mutually supporting positions dug into ridges that dominated the surrounding terrain. Every approach was covered by overlapping fields of fire. Artillery was pre-registered on likely avenues of advance. Cave systems allowed defenders to shelter from bombardment, then emerge to rain fire on attacking forces. By mid-April, American forces had battered themselves against these defenses with appalling casualties. Kakazu Ridge, Nishibaru Ridge, Tombstone Ridge, names that meant nothing before the battle became synonymous with suffering. Units attacked, took ground measured in yards, then faced ferocious Japanese counterattacks. The grinding, attritional warfare consumed entire battalions. The 96th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Deadeyes, had fought its way south through some of the worst terrain and most fanatical resistance encountered in the Pacific War. By early June, the division had been in continuous combat for over 2 months. Casualties had been severe. Replacements filled the ranks, green troops learning quickly or dying. The 383rd Infantry Regiment of the 96th Division had distinguished itself repeatedly. At Kakazu Ridge in April, companies of the 383rd had reached the crest only to be pinned down and forced to withdraw with heavy casualties. Throughout May, the regiment had fought through the Shuri Line's defences as the Japanese gradually withdrew to their final defensive positions. By June, American forces had finally broken through the Shuri Line. The Japanese had retreated to the southern tip of Okinawa, where they prepared for a final stand. But even in retreat, Japanese defences remained formidable. Every ridge, every hill, every cave system required reduction. The fighting remained brutal. It was in this context that the M20 recoilless rifle arrived on Okinawa, the official U.S. Army history of the Okinawa campaign states that equipment issued to troops included weapons and instruments of war never before used against the Japanese. Among these were the highly effective 57mm M18 and 75mm M20 anti-tank recoilless rifles. The first 50 production M18 57mm recoilless rifles had been rushed to Europe in March 1945. They saw limited combat with the 17th Airborne Division near Essen, Germany, and with U.S. forces in the Po Valley in Italy during the spring offensive. But the weapon's true test came in the Pacific. The M18 first saw combat in the Pacific Theater during the Battle of Okinawa on June 9, 1945. Units of the 96th Division received the weapons as they pushed south. Soldiers, exhausted from 2 months of continuous combat, suddenly found themselves issued strange new weapons they had never seen before. No extensive training, no practice ammunition for familiarization, just basic instructions and live rounds. The weapons were needed immediately. Japanese positions had to be reduced. There was no time for proper training programs. Sergeants and squad leaders received hasty demonstrations, then passed the information to their men. Load the round, aim at the target, make sure nobody is behind the weapon, squeeze the trigger. The simplicity was deliberate. Unlike complex artillery pieces requiring extensive training, The recoilless rifles were designed so that any reasonably competent soldier could operate them after minimal instruction. This reflected American military philosophy. Equipment should be simple enough that citizen soldiers, not career professionals, could use it effectively. On June 10, 1945, soldiers of the 383rd Infantry Regiment prepared to use the M20 in combat for the first time. Their target was a Japanese machine gun nest concealed in a cave entrance approximately 400 yards distant. The position had been identified days earlier. Attempts to reduce it with conventional weapons had failed. Artillery fire couldn't reach into the cave system. The entrance was too small, too well protected by the surrounding rock. Mortars landing near the entrance had no effect. The Japanese had positioned the machine gun deep enough that fragments couldn't reach it. Infantry assault was suicide. The machine gun covered all approaches. Attempting to close with the position meant crossing open ground under fire. Even if soldiers reached the cave entrance, reducing the position would require flamethrowers or demolition charges, requiring men to get within arm's reach of a determined enemy. Airstrikes were impractical. The target was too small. Dropping bombs or napalm on the ridge would accomplish nothing except alerting the Japanese to an impending ground assault. The M20 offered an alternative. The gun crew wrestled the weapon into position, setting up the tripod and, mounting the barrel, a third soldier established security, watching for Japanese snipers or infiltrators who might target the crew. The loader prepared ammunition, high explosive rounds. The shaped charge anti-tank rounds were designed for penetrating armor, not for use against fortifications. The HE rounds would be more effective, fragmenting on impact and sending shrapnel into the confined space of the cave system. The gunner settled behind the weapon, looking through the telescopic sight. 400 yards, well within effective range. The cave entrance was clearly visible, a dark opening in the coral limestone. He could see the muzzle flash of the machine gun as it fired bursts at American positions. The gunner made his final adjustments. Elevation, windage. The weapon was aimed. The loader inserted the first round, closing the breech with a metallic click. The gunner took a breath, let it out slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The weapon fired with a distinctive crack whoosh. The projectile screamed across the distance. Behind the weapon, a massive plume of flame and gas erupted from the exhaust port, scorching the ground for 60 feet. The shell struck directly at the cave entrance. The explosion was tremendous. 14 pounds of high explosive detonating in a confined space created overpressure that was devastating. Limestone and coral fragmented into deadly shrapnel. The shockwave propagated through the cave system, stunning or killing anyone inside. When the smoke cleared, the machine gun was silent. Soldiers who had been pinned down for hours cautiously raised their heads. No fire. The position was dead. The gun crew loaded another round and fired at a second cave entrance nearby. Another suspected position. Same result. Explosion. Silence. In minutes, positions that had held for days were neutralized. News of the weapon's effectiveness spread rapidly through the division. Other units requested the recoilless rifles. More M20s and M18s were brought forward. Crews learned through trial and error. Several incidents occurred where soldiers or Marines wandered into the danger zone behind a weapon and were injured or killed when it fired. Units learned to establish clear zones and post guards to keep the area clear. The weapons were also vulnerable to counterfire. Setting up the tripod, mounting the weapon, and preparing to fire took time. Japanese observers could see the distinctive weapon and call for mortar or artillery fire. Crews learned to fire quickly, then displaced to new positions before counterfire arrived. Despite these limitations, the recoilless rifles proved invaluable. They gave infantry units the ability to engage fortifications that previously required extensive support from artillery, airstrikes, or tanks. A 2- or 3-man crew with a recoilless rifle could accomplish what had previously required calling in fire support and waiting for availability, coordination, and execution. The psychological impact on Japanese defenders was significant. For weeks, they had sheltered in caves and fortifications, confident that American firepower couldn't reach them. Artillery and mortar fire was survivable underground. You simply stayed deep in the cave system until the bombardment ended, then emerged to engage attacking American infantry. But the recoilless rifles changed that equation. The weapons fired directly at cave entrances. The shells detonated inside the protective rock. There was no shelter from this fire. The Americans could reach you anywhere. A Popular Science Monthly article from September 1945 described the impact. An excited Japanese officer on Okinawa, practically catapulted into the arms of his enemies by gunfire, demanded through an interpreter to be shown something. He was interested in only one thing: the new American artillery that popped up anywhere and everywhere on the battlefield, broke all the rules of heavy gun mobility. This anecdote, while impossible to verify independently, reflects the weapon's psychological impact. Japanese forces had prepared defensive positions based on their understanding of American capabilities. Heavy weapons meant artillery, which required substantial logistics, prepared positions, and time to set up. American infantry might have mortars and machine guns, but not artillery-type firepower. The recoilless rifles demolished this assumption. Suddenly, American rifle companies possessed weapons that could destroy fortifications. These weapons appeared anywhere infantry could go, which on Okinawa's broken terrain meant nearly everywhere. Positions that had seemed secure were now vulnerable. The weapon's versatility extended beyond cave destruction. American soldiers discovered that the 75mm M20 could engage targets that conventional weapons struggled with. On Okinawa, one shot from the M20 destroyed a camouflaged machine gun nest and killed 2 snipers at a range of 400 yards. The precision direct fire capability meant crews could target specific enemy positions without the collateral damage of area bombardment. At a range of 3/4 of a mile, 11 rounds from a 75mm scored 2 hits on each of 2 caves, concealing Japanese artillery. All the Japanese gunners were killed. This represented exceptional accuracy for a weapon that had just entered service with crews who had minimal training. The rifle's stability during firing contributed to this accuracy. Without recoil throwing off the aim, gunners could observe their shots impacting and make immediate corrections. At a range of 1.5 miles, 7 shots from a 75mm scored 3 hits in a cave mouth, measuring 5 feet by 2 feet. This level of precision was unprecedented for portable infantry weapons. Hitting a target that small at that distance required skill, but the weapon's design made it possible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 57mm M18 proved equally effective in its role. Weighing only 45 pounds and measuring 61 inches long, the M18 could be fired from the shoulder as accurately as a Garand rifle. It hurled a 2 3/4 pound shell 2.5 miles. One man could carry and fire it if necessary, though normal operation used a 2-man crew. The M18's primary advantage was portability. Where the M20 required 2 men to carry it and ideally operated from a tripod, the M18 could be shoulder-fired by a single soldier in a pinch. For rapid engagements against emerging targets, this mobility proved invaluable. Both weapons used similar ammunition types, high explosive shells for general use against fortifications and infantry. Shaped charge, HATE, rounds for armor penetration. White phosphorus smoke rounds for screening or marking targets. The smoke rounds proved particularly effective on Okinawa. Japanese positions often occupied reverse slopes or were concealed in ways that made them difficult to spot. White phosphorus rounds could mark targets for supporting arms or create smoke that forced defenders out of positions where they could be engaged. The recoilless rifles arrived on Okinawa as part of a broader technological surge. The island served as a testing ground for numerous weapon systems that would shape the future of warfare. Alongside the recoilless rifles came other innovations never before used against the Japanese. New type flamethrower tanks with increased effective range and larger fuel capacity terrified Japanese defenders. The psychological impact of these weapons, which could burn defenders alive in their fortifications, was immense. 110 sniper scopes, and 140 snooper scopes were issued to each division. The snooper scopes used infrared technology to see in the dark, a revolutionary capability. Soldiers could observe enemy movements at night and engage targets in complete darkness. This negated one of the Japanese military's traditional advantages, their skill at night infiltration and attack. Army artillery and anti-aircraft units used proximity, or VT fuses, over land areas for the first time in the Pacific. These fuses used radio signals to detonate shells at optimal altitude above the target, creating devastating airburst effects. Against Japanese troops in the open or in shallow trenches, proximity fuses multiplied artillery effectiveness. Tests were also conducted with new mortar loading devices, sound locator equipment, and 4.2-inch recoilless mortars. The American military was preparing for the invasion of Japan itself, and Okinawa served as the final laboratory to test weapons and tactics before that apocalyptic battle. But among all these innovations, the recoilless rifles captured the imagination of soldiers who used them. The weapons represented a fundamental shift in infantry capability. For decades, infantry had been vulnerable to fortifications. A machine gun nest in a concrete bunker could pin down entire companies. Reducing such positions required armor support, artillery, or airstrikes, all of which took time to coordinate and might not be available when needed. The recoilless rifles changed that calculation. Every infantry company could now possess organic weapons capable of destroying fortifications without external support. The weapons weren't perfect substitutes for artillery or armor, but they provided immediate firepower that could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The impact on tactics was immediate and profound. Units began incorporating the recoilless rifles into their assault plans. Rather than calling for artillery preparation before an attack, companies could advance, with recoilless rifles providing direct fire support as targets emerged. The weapons proved ideal for reducing strong points during the assault. When infantry encountered an unexpected bunker or fortified position, the recoilless rifle crew could engage it immediately, rather than calling for support and waiting while the advance stalled and casualties mounted. This capability accelerated the pace of operations. American forces could maintain momentum through terrain that would previously have required repeated pauses to reduce defensive positions. On Okinawa, this acceleration was measured in yards and hours rather than miles and days, but in attritional warfare, where every yard cost lives, any advantage mattered. Japanese defensive doctrine had been predicated on forcing American attacks into killing zones where prepared positions could inflict maximum casualties. The longer American forces remained in the killing zone, the more damage Japanese weapons could inflict. Recoilless rifles reduced the time infantry spent exposed. Positions could be engaged and neutralized quickly, allowing the assault to continue. The weapon also proved effective in the indirect fire support role, though this wasn't its primary purpose. When necessary, crews could elevate the weapon and fire at higher angles, providing plunging fire against reverse slope positions or targets behind cover. This versatility meant that recoilless rifles could supplement mortar fire when needed. Japanese defenders learned to recognize the distinctive crack-whoosh sound of recoilless rifle fire. The sound differed from conventional artillery or mortars. Once you heard it, you knew what was coming. The sound of recoilless rifles firing became associated with the destruction of defensive positions. Soldiers in fortifications that had previously seemed secure suddenly understood they were vulnerable. This psychological dimension cannot be overstated. Much of warfare is psychological. The side that believes it can win often does. The side that believes defeat is inevitable often collapses before being physically destroyed. Japanese forces on Okinawa fought with legendary tenacity. The Bushido Code emphasized death before surrender. Yet even the most fanatically determined soldier fights less effectively when he believes his position is doomed. The appearance of recoilless rifles contributed to a growing sense among Japanese defenders that American firepower had become overwhelming. For every defensive measure, the Americans developed a counter. For every fortification, they possessed a weapon to destroy it. The recoilless rifles were particularly devastating when used in combination with other weapons. Tank infantry teams would advance with recoilless rifles providing overwatch. When tanks drew fire from concealed positions, revealing their locations, the recoilless rifles could engage those positions while tanks suppressed other threats. Flamethrower tanks and recoilless rifles worked in deadly combination. The recoilless rifles would blast open fortifications, creating breaches that flamethrower tanks could exploit, pumping burning fuel into the exposed positions. Artillery could suppress suspected enemy positions with high explosive and white phosphorus, forcing defenders to take cover, while recoilless rifles engaged confirmed targets with precision fire. This combined arms approach, using the strengths of each weapon system to compensate for the weaknesses of others, represented American military doctrine at its finest. The 96th Infantry Division's after-action reports praised the recoilless rifles effusively. Units requested more weapons. Soldiers who had initially been skeptical, viewing the strange new weapons with suspicion, became advocates once they saw them in action. The weapons gave ordinary infantrymen power they had never possessed before. A private first class with a few hours of training could destroy a fortification that might have required an airstrike or a tank assault. This democratization of firepower was quintessentially American. The U.S. military had always emphasized giving individual soldiers and small units the capability to accomplish missions independently. Initiative and flexibility at the lowest levels made American forces adaptable and dangerous. Recoilless rifles fit this philosophy perfectly. They required minimal training, could be operated by small crews, and provided devastating capability at the squad or platoon level. Compare this to Japanese military doctrine, which emphasized centralized control and rigid adherence to plans. Japanese units often struggled to adapt when situations changed unexpectedly. American units, by contrast, could respond immediately to emerging threats because they possessed the tools and authority to do so at lower levels. The recoilless rifle became symbolic of this fundamental difference in military philosophy. Other nations had developed recoilless weapons. The Germans had fielded them first. But the American approach, mass production of simple, reliable weapons and widespread distribution to frontline units, maximized their impact. By June 1945, as fighting on Okinawa entered its final phase, the recoilless rifles had proven themselves beyond doubt. Production ramped up dramatically. Orders were placed for thousands of additional weapons to support the planned invasion of Japan. Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu scheduled for November 1945, would involve over 14 divisions. Each division would receive substantial numbers of recoilless rifles. Operation Coronet, the subsequent invasion of Honshu planned for March 1946, would employ even more divisions and even more weapons. American planners anticipated that fighting on the Japanese home islands would make Okinawa look like a skirmish. The Japanese had 60 million people on the home islands. Intelligence indicated that the entire population was being mobilized for defense. Every man, woman, and older child was being trained to resist. Bamboo spears, explosive charges, suicide tactics. The Americans expected millions of Japanese casualties and hundreds of thousands of American casualties. In this nightmare scenario, every weapon that gave American soldiers an advantage was precious. The recoilless rifles would allow infantry to reduce fortifications rapidly, limiting exposure and casualties. But the invasion never came. On August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The war ended without the apocalyptic battles that had seemed inevitable. The recoilless rifles that had been produced for the invasion of Japan found themselves relegated to storage or training use. The urgency that had driven their development and deployment evaporated overnight, yet the weapons didn't disappear. They had proven their worth on Okinawa. The concept had been validated. Infantry needed portable, powerful, direct-fire weapons. The recoilless rifle provided that capability in a package that could be mass-produced and widely distributed. When the Korean War erupted on June 25, 1950, recoilless rifles suddenly became critically important again. North Korean forces, equipped with Soviet-supplied 3485 tanks, poured across the 38th parallel. South Korean forces possessed limited anti-tank weapons. The United States rushed to provide support. Among the weapons sent to Korea were M9A1 bazookas and M20 recoilless rifles. The bazooka, which had proven effective against German tanks in World War II, failed completely against the 34. The Soviet tank's frontal armor measured 90 to 100 millimeters. The bazooka's 2.36-inch rocket couldn't penetrate it. American forces, caught by surprise and equipped with World War II-era weapons, found themselves unable to stop North Korean armor. The M20 recoilless rifle was supposed to be the answer. With shaped charge ammunition capable of penetrating 100 millimeters of armor, it should have been effective against 34 tanks. In theory, it could destroy them. In practice, the results were disappointing. On July 5, 1950, Task Force Smith, consisting of 406 U.S. soldiers, faced North Korean forces supported by 34 tanks. The Americans fired 22 M9A1 bazooka rockets at the tanks with zero effect. They also engaged with M20 recoilless rifles. The weapons failed to stop the tanks. Task Force Smith was routed. The problem wasn't the weapon's penetration capability. The M20 could penetrate 34 armor if the shot hit properly. The problem was hitting the target under combat conditions. Tanks move quickly. Engaging a moving target at several hundred yards, range with a direct-fire weapon requires skill and training. American forces in the early days of the Korean War lacked both. They had been on occupation duty in Japan. Training had been neglected. Soldiers were poorly prepared for combat. When suddenly thrust into battle against an enemy with armor support, they couldn't employ their weapons effectively. Additionally, the shaped charge round's effectiveness depended on striking the armor at proper angles. A glancing hit might not penetrate. Hitting sloped armor reduced effectiveness. Tank crews quickly learned that if they kept moving and presented frontal armor, they were relatively safe from recoilless rifle fire. The M20's true value in Korea emerged in a different role. As infantry support weapon against fortifications, it excelled. North Korean and later Chinese forces dug extensive trench systems and bunker complexes. The recoilless rifles could destroy these positions with precision. Fire. Against infantry in the open or in light cover, the high explosive rounds were devastating. White phosphorus rounds proved excellent for marking targets or creating smoke screens. In the mountainous Korean terrain, where armor was often restricted to valleys and roads, the recoilless rifle's portability allowed it to go anywhere infantry went. Crews could manhandle the weapons up steep hillsides where conventional artillery couldn't reach. Once positioned, they could engage targets on opposite hillsides or in valleys below. This capability made the M20 invaluable in the static warfare that characterized much of the Korean conflict after the first year. By 1952, American forces had received the 3.5-inch M20 Super Bazooka, which proved effective against 34 tanks. The recoilless rifle's primary anti-tank role was largely taken over by this improved rocket launcher. But the M20 remained in service throughout the Korean War, in the infantry support role. Veterans of Korea recalled the weapon fondly. It was reliable. It packed tremendous punch. It could be used in situations where other weapons were impractical. One soldier could operate it if necessary, though 2 or 3 was better. The sound of an M20 firing became as familiar to Korean War veterans as the sound of the Moen-Garand rifle or the Browning machine gun. The weapon remained in American inventory through the 1950s and into the 1960s. It saw limited use in the early years of the Vietnam War, particularly against fortified positions. But by the mid-1960s, newer weapons were replacing it. Wire-guided anti-tank missiles offered longer range and higher accuracy. Disposable single-shot rocket launchers like the M72 LAW provided similar capability in a lighter package. The M40 recoilless rifle, a 106mm weapon introduced in 1953, offered superior performance in roles where recoilless rifles were still relevant. The M20 was gradually phased out of frontline service, yet the weapon continued to serve in unexpected roles. Until ammunition stockpiles were exhausted in the 1990s, the U.S. National Forest Service and National Park Service used M20 recoilless rifles to start controlled avalanches. In areas where heavy snow accumulation created avalanche danger, rangers would fire recoilless rifle rounds into snow-laden slopes. The explosions would trigger avalanches under controlled conditions, preventing larger, more dangerous slides later. This creative reuse of obsolete military equipment served a valuable public safety function for decades. Internationally, the M20 had a longer service life. Many nations that received the weapons through military aid programs continued using them long after the United States had retired them. The Royal Moroccan Army used M20s during the Western Sahara War against the Polisario Front. From 1975 through 1991, China produced unlicensed copies of the M20, designated Type 52 and Type 56. The Type 52 was an exact copy. The Type 56 was an improved version that could fire fin-stabilized heat shells, improving armor penetration. These Chinese copies saw extensive service with the North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. The North Vietnamese captured American M20s during the Korean War, when Chinese forces overran American positions. They studied these weapons and later received Chinese copies. Against South Vietnamese and American forces in Vietnam, the Type 52 and 56 proved effective in ambushes and attacks on fortified positions. The weapons also appeared in other Cold War conflicts. Photographs suggest their use by guerrillas and militias in the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 through 1990. Wherever Soviet or Chinese-supplied forces fought, Western-supplied forces, recoilless rifles appeared on both sides. The fundamental design pioneered by the M20 influenced weapons development for decades. Modern recoilless rifles like the Carl Gustaf, introduced in 1948 and still in service with many armies today, follow the same basic principles. Vent propellant gases rearward to eliminate recoil. Use direct fire against targets. Provide infantry with portable firepower. The shaped charge warhead principle that made recoilless rifles effective against armor evolved into the modern heat rounds used by tank cannons and anti-tank missiles. The concept of portable infantry anti-armor weapons led directly to modern guided missiles like the Javelin and TOW systems. But perhaps the M20's most important legacy was psychological and doctrinal. It demonstrated that infantry didn't have to be helpless against fortifications or armor. Small units with the right weapons and training could accomplish missions that previously required massive fire support. This shaped American military thinking about infantry capabilities. Modern infantry squads possess firepower that would have amazed World War II soldiers. Automatic rifles, grenade launchers, anti-tank weapons, portable radios linking them to artillery, air support, and higher headquarters. This firepower and connectivity traces its roots to weapons like the M20. The philosophy that every soldier should be as capable and well-equipped as possible is distinctly American. Other militaries emphasize different approaches: mass mobilization, centralized control, specialized elite units supported by less capable regular forces. The American approach, making every infantryman a highly capable fighter with access to devastating weapons, reflects democratic ideals and industrial capacity. Any citizen soldier, given proper equipment and basic training, can be effective. You don't need a lifetime of military service to master the tools. The M20 embodied this philosophy. A farmer from Iowa or a mechanic from Detroit could learn to operate it in a few hours. Once trained, they possessed capability equivalent to a light artillery piece. That democratization of military power was revolutionary. Looking back from the 21st century, the M20 seems primitive. Modern weapons are lighter, more accurate, longer ranged, and more lethal. Guided missiles strike targets miles away with precision. Drones provide surveillance, and can engage targets remotely. Infantry platoons possess capabilities that entire battalions lacked in 1945, yet the fundamental problems remain unchanged. Infantry must reduce fortifications. Infantry must defeat armoured vehicles. Infantry must accomplish missions without always having time to wait for support. The M20 represented an early solution to these eternal problems. Subsequent weapons have been refinements and improvements, but the basic concept endures. The soldiers of the 96th Infantry Division, who first fired M20 recoilless rifles in combat on Okinawa in June 1945, had no idea they were wielding a historically significant weapon. They simply knew it worked. It destroyed Japanese positions that had resisted other weapons. It saved American lives by reducing the time infantry spent exposed to enemy fire. For those men, fighting in the final weeks of the bloodiest battle in the Pacific War, the M20 was simply another tool. But it was an effective tool, and in combat, effectiveness is everything. The Japanese defenders of Okinawa, fighting from fortifications carved into coral and limestone, confident that American firepower couldn't reach them deep underground, discovered that confidence was misplaced. The strange new American weapons that appeared in June could destroy their positions, could reach them in caves and bunkers that had seemed invulnerable. The psychological impact of this realization was devastating. If there was no safe place, if the Americans possessed weapons that could find you anywhere, what was the point of continued resistance? Some Japanese soldiers surrendered, an extremely rare occurrence earlier in the war. More fought to the death, as their code demanded, but without the confidence that had sustained them through months of combat. The Americans had demonstrated that technological innovation and industrial capacity could overcome even the most fanatical defense. This was the true lesson of Okinawa, and the recoilless rifle was one of the weapons that taught it. By the time organized Japanese resistance ended on Okinawa on June 22, 1945, the island had been transformed into a wasteland. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan conscripts were dead. Over 12,000 Americans had been killed. At least 100,000 Okinawan civilians perished, caught in the crossfire or forced to commit suicide by Japanese military authorities. The island's cities were rubble, its forests were shattered stumps, the beautiful coral reefs were contaminated with oil, fuel, and blood. Okinawa had been the most destructive battle in the Pacific War, exceeding even Iwo Jima in its ferocity. The M20 recoilless rifle had played a small part in that destruction, arriving late in the battle and seeing only limited use before the fighting ended. But its impact extended far beyond Okinawa. The weapon proved that recoilless technology was practical. It validated the concept of portable infantry artillery. It demonstrated that shaped charge warheads could be delivered effectively by direct-fire weapons. These lessons shaped weapons development for decades. When veterans of Okinawa returned home, many retained vivid memories of the recoilless rifles, the distinctive crack-whoosh sound, the massive backblast that scorched the ground behind the weapon, the devastating impact when shells struck their targets. For soldiers, who had spent weeks battering themselves against fortifications that seemed impregnable, the recoilless rifles represented hope. Finally, infantry possessed tools that could reduce those fortifications without requiring massive support from other arms. The M20's story is not one of dramatic battlefield dominance. It arrived too late in World War II to have strategic impact. It proved ineffective in its designed anti-tank role during Korea. It was phased out of service relatively quickly, as newer weapons emerged. Yet it was significant because it pioneered a concept that transformed infantry warfare. Before recoilless rifles, infantry were vulnerable to anything protected by armor or fortifications. After recoilless rifles, infantry possessed organic weapons that could engage those targets. This shift in capability altered tactics, doctrine, and the fundamental balance of power on the battlefield. The Germans had developed recoilless weapons first. Soviet and British engineers had contributed critical innovations, but the Americans perfected mass production and widespread distribution. They created weapons simple enough that any soldier could use them and produced them in sufficient numbers that frontline units could actually receive them. This American approach, practical innovation combined with industrial capacity, proved decisive in World War II and shaped the military balance for decades afterward. The M20 recoilless rifle demonstrated these American strengths perfectly. It wasn't the most sophisticated weapon. It had significant limitations. The backblast was dangerous. Accuracy was dependent on crew skill. It couldn't replace artillery or armor, but it worked well enough, was simple enough, and was produced in sufficient numbers to make a difference. In warfare, adequate solutions widely available often prove more valuable than perfect solutions in limited supply. The Japanese officer on Okinawa, who demanded to see the American artillery that broke all the rules, understood this instinctively. The Americans had fielded weapons that shouldn't exist according to conventional military wisdom. Artillery that could be carried by 2 men. Guns that fired without recoil. Precision fire from portable weapons. How could Japanese defenses be designed to counter capabilities that seemed impossible? This question haunted Japanese military planners as they prepared for the inevitable invasion of the home islands. If Okinawa, with its extensive fortifications and fanatical defenders, had fallen to American firepower, what hope did Japan have? The recoilless rifles were only one weapon among many that the Americans would employ. The atomic bombs that ended the war before the invasion could begin demonstrated that American technological and industrial superiority had reached a point where conventional defense was futile. The M20's legacy is visible in every modern infantry platoon. Soldiers carry portable weapons capable of defeating, armor and destroying fortifications. The specific weapons have changed. The underlying capability remains. From the M20 to the M72 LAW to the AT-4 to the Javelin missile, the progression is clear. Each weapon improved on its predecessor, but all traced their lineage to the recoilless rifles that first gave infantry organic anti-armor and bunker-busting capability. Military historians studying the Pacific War often focus on major battles and dramatic turning points. Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, the atomic bombings. The M20 recoilless rifle doesn't feature prominently in these narratives. It was a minor weapon that arrived late and saw limited use. Yet, minor innovations often have major long-term impacts. The M20 pioneered a category of weapons that became standard infantry equipment. It demonstrated that technological innovation could give decisive advantages even in the brutal attritional warfare that characterized the Pacific Island campaigns. Most importantly, it gave individual soldiers power they had never possessed before. The ability to destroy fortifications without waiting for support. The capability to engage targets that previously required calling in artillery or airstrikes. This empowerment of small units and individual soldiers reflected the democratic ideals that America was fighting for. Every citizen soldier deserved the best equipment and the capability to make a difference. The M20 recoilless rifle, carried into combat on Okinawa in June 1945, embodied that ideal. Its distinctive crack-whoosh sound echoed across battlefields from the Pacific to Korea to Vietnam. The weapon itself is obsolete now, replaced by more capable systems. But the concept endures, and modern infantry owes a debt to the engineers who solved the recoil problem and the soldiers who first carried these strange new weapons into battle. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.